They called her a fool for trying to farm alone, but Sarah Mitchell knew the land held more than just broken dreams buried beneath its frost-hardened soil. The morning air bit at her cheeks as she stood on the porch of her weathered cabin, the foreclosure notice trembling in her numb fingers. 8 months had passed since the fever took Thomas, and with each dawn, the weight of his absence pressed deeper into her bones. The wind carried the scent of coming snow across the Colorado territory, whistling through the gaps in the barn walls that she could not afford to repair. Her breath formed small clouds in the brittle air as she read the words again, though she had memorized every cruel syllable. 30 days. 30 days to find money she did not have for land that held her husband's sweat and her own stubborn hope. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Your comment helps our community grow stronger. Thanks, and let's get back to the story. Sarah folded the paper with deliberate care, as if gentle handling could soften its harsh verdict. The chickens clucked impatiently from their coop, reminding her that despair was a luxury she could not afford. There were chores to be done, animals to feed, and somehow, a miracle to find in the next 30 days. The kitchen still smelled of the cornbread she had baked before dawn, a small comfort in the face of overwhelming uncertainty. She poured coffee from the pot that had grown cold while she stared at the notice, the bitter liquid matching her mood. Through the window, she could see the fence line where 3 of her cattle should have been grazing. 3 more had disappeared in the night, following the pattern that had plagued her for weeks. Thomas would have known what to do. He would have tracked the missing animals, confronted whoever was taking them, fought for what was theirs. But Thomas was buried beneath the oak tree on the hill, and she was alone with problems that seemed to multiply like weeds in untended soil. The sound of hoofbeats broke through her brooding thoughts. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch, shading her eyes against the pale morning sun. A lone rider approached on a paint horse, moving with the easy confidence of someone who belonged to the land itself. As he drew closer, she could see he was Navajo, his long black hair bound back, his clothing a mixture of traditional and territorial practical wear. Her neighbors would not approve of her speaking with him alone. The same neighbors who had avoided her since Thomas died, who whispered about the impropriety of a young widow managing a homestead without male guidance. Their disapproval had lost its sting months ago, worn away by the daily struggle of survival. The rider stopped at her gate, his dark eyes taking in the rundown condition of her property with an expression she could not read. He was perhaps 30 years old, with strong features and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. When he spoke, his voice carried the careful precision of someone speaking a language learned rather than born to. "My name is Joseph Silverwind," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. "I work with the territorial marshal, tracking stolen livestock. I believe some of your cattle may have been taken by the same men who have been raiding both settler and Navajo herds." Sarah felt a flutter of hope mixed with wariness. She had reported her missing cattle to the local sheriff, but he had shown little interest in the complaints of a woman he considered incapable of managing her affairs. The idea that someone might actually help her seemed too good to be true, yet the stranger's manner suggested sincerity. "How do you know about my cattle?" she asked, stepping closer to the gate but not opening it. The habits of caution ran deep, even in desperation. Joseph dismounted and approached slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "I have been tracking sign for 3 weeks, following a pattern of thefts that stretches from the Navajo reservation to the settler communities. The men responsible are organized, taking animals from isolated properties where resistance will be minimal." He gestured toward her missing fence rails and the churned earth where her cattle had been grazing. "The tracks here match those I have seen at other sites. Boot prints from 3 different men, horses shod in a distinctive pattern, and signs that the cattle were driven north toward the canyon country." Sarah's heart quickened with a mixture of hope and fear. If someone was indeed stealing her livestock systematically, it meant the losses were not her fault, not proof of her inadequacy as Thomas's successor. But it also meant she was dealing with criminals who might be dangerous if confronted. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her hand resting on the gate latch. Joseph's expression remained steady, patient. "I want to recover your cattle and stop these thieves before they take more. But I need someone who knows this area, who can identify which animals belong to which ranchers. You know your land and your neighbor's properties better than anyone." The proposition was both appealing and terrifying. Sarah had spent months feeling helpless, watching her livelihood disappear piece by piece. The chance to take action, to fight back against the forces threatening to destroy her future, stirred something fierce and determined in her chest. But she was also a woman alone, being asked to venture into dangerous territory with a stranger. The practical voice in her head, the one that sounded like her late mother, whispered warnings about propriety and safety. Yet the same voice reminded her that propriety would not save her land, and safety was an illusion when she was already losing everything. "Why should I trust you?" she asked, though something in his demeanor was already answering the question. Joseph considered her words carefully before responding. "Because we both have something to lose if these men continue their work. They have taken cattle from my people as well, and they show no respect for territorial boundaries or treaties. Because I give you my word that I will help you recover what has been stolen, and my word is not given lightly." He paused, studying her face with eyes that seemed to see more than most. "And because you are already fighting this battle alone, and it is not going well." The blunt assessment stung, but Sarah could not argue with its accuracy. Her pride had kept her from asking for help from neighbors who had made their disapproval clear, but pride would not pay her debts or save her home. "If I agree to help you, what exactly would that involve?" she asked, her practical nature asserting itself even as her heart urged her toward action. Joseph's expression softened slightly, as if he recognized the courage it took for her to ask. "We would track the stolen herds together, following the trail north into the canyon country. It will require camping out for several nights, moving carefully to avoid detection, and potentially confronting dangerous men. I will not lie to you about the risks." Sarah felt her breath catch at the implications. A respectable widow did not venture into the wilderness alone with any man, let alone one from a different culture. The scandal would follow her for the rest of her life, assuming she survived the experience. But respectability had not saved her marriage from fever, had not protected her from poverty, had not kept her cattle from being stolen. Perhaps it was time to choose survival over reputation. "When would we leave?" she asked, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "Today, if you are willing," Joseph replied. "The trail grows colder with each hour, and winter weather will soon make tracking impossible." Sarah looked back at her cabin, at the life she had built with Thomas and was now fighting to preserve alone. The foreclosure notice lay on the kitchen table, counting down the days until she lost everything. Traditional solutions had failed her. Perhaps it was time to try something different. "Give me an hour to prepare," she said, opening the gate at last. Joseph nodded and remounted his horse. "I will gather supplies and return. Dress warmly and bring whatever food you can spare. We may be gone for several days." As he rode away, Sarah stood in her doorway and wondered if she had just made the wisest or most foolish decision of her life. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the frost and revealing the day's potential. For the first time in months, she felt the stirring of something that might have been hope. Inside the cabin, she moved with purpose born of necessity. She packed cornbread and dried meat, filled her water bottles, and selected her warmest clothing. Her hand shook slightly as she loaded Thomas's rifle, checking the ammunition with the care he had taught her. She had never fired it in anger, but desperation had a way of teaching new skills quickly. The small mirror above her washstand reflected a woman she barely recognized. Months of struggle had carved away the softness from her face, leaving sharp cheekbones and eyes that had seen too much loss. Her brown hair, once carefully arranged according to fashion, was now braided simply for practicality. She looked like someone who could survive in the wilderness, even if she did not feel like it. When Joseph returned, he brought a pack horse loaded with supplies and a quiet confidence that helped steady her nerves. He had changed into clothing better suited for tracking, practical garments that would blend with the landscape. His rifle rested easily in its saddle scabbard, and he carried himself with the alertness of someone accustomed to danger. "Are you certain about this?" he asked as she emerged from the cabin with her pack. "Once we leave, there will be no turning back until we finish what we start." Sarah locked her cabin door and pocketed the key, a symbolic gesture that felt like stepping off a cliff into empty air. "I am certain that staying here and waiting for disaster will accomplish nothing. Whatever happens, at least I will have tried to fight back." They rode north from her property as the sun reached its zenith, following faint tracks that Sarah would never have noticed on her own. Joseph moved ahead, reading the ground like a book written in dirt and stone, occasionally dismounting to examine sign more closely. He explained what he was seeing, teaching her to recognize the difference between her stolen cattle's hoofprints and those of wild animals. The landscape gradually changed as they climbed into the foothills, leaving behind the rolling grassland where settlers had built their homesteads. Here, the terrain was rougher, carved by ancient streams into a maze of ravines and rocky outcroppings. It was beautiful in its harshness, but also unforgiving to those who did not understand its ways. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah began to appreciate Joseph's knowledge of the country. He led them along game trails that saved hours of difficult climbing, found water where she would have seen only dry rock, and read the weather signs and cloud formations and wind patterns. His competence was reassuring, even as it highlighted her own ignorance of the land she had called home for 3 years. They made camp as the sun touched the western mountains, choosing a sheltered spot near a spring that bubbled from the rocks. Joseph built a small fire that would be invisible from a distance, using drywood that produced little smoke. He moved with economical efficiency, wasting no motion or energy. Sarah helped where she could, gathering firewood and preparing a simple meal from their combined supplies. The domestic routine felt strange in the wilderness setting, a reminder of how far she had traveled from her normal life in the space of a single day. As darkness settled around their small circle of firelight, Joseph began to share what he knew about the men they were tracking. There were at least 4 of them, possibly more, operating with military precision that suggested leadership and planning. They struck quickly and vanished into country they knew well, making pursuit difficult for local lawmen who were unfamiliar with the terrain. "They have been selling the stolen cattle to buyers in distant markets," Joseph explained, his voice low to avoid carrying in the still air. "Probably driving them to railroad towns where questions are not asked about ownership. It is a profitable business for men with no conscience." Sarah stared into the flames and thought about the careful calculations she had made when purchasing each animal, the hopes she had invested in building her herd. To these thieves, her cattle were simply commodities, her dreams irrelevant to their profit margins. "How long have you been tracking them?" she asked. 3 weeks since I was hired by the territorial marshal, Joseph replied. But I have been aware of their activities for longer. They have taken animals from my people as well, including horses that were gifts from my grandfather. This is personal for me also. There was a quiet intensity in his voice that spoke of controlled anger and deep commitment. Sarah found herself studying his profile in the firelight, noting the strength in his features and the careful way he chose his words. She was beginning to understand that her first impression of him as merely competent was inadequate. He was a man driven by purpose, someone who understood justice and was willing to fight for it. "Tell me about your grandfather's horses," she said, sensing that the story mattered to him. Joseph was quiet for a long moment, poking at the fire with a stick until sparks danced upward into the darkness. "They were descended from horses my people have bred for generations," he said finally. "Animals that could travel long distances over rough country, intelligent and loyal. My grandfather spent years selecting and training them, passing down knowledge that came from his grandfather and beyond." He paused, his expression distant with memory. "When he gave them to me, it was not just a gift of valuable animals. It was a trust, a responsibility to continue the tradition and pass it on to the next generation. The thieves who took them do not understand this. To them, the horses are simply goods to be sold." Sarah felt a deep resonance with his words. Her own connection to the land and animals came from different traditions, but the sense of responsibility and continuity was the same. The cattle these men had stolen represented not just financial investment, but her commitment to honoring Thomas's work and building something lasting. "I understand," she said quietly. "My husband and I chose each animal carefully, planning for the future we were going to build together. When they take our livestock, they are stealing more than property." Joseph met her eyes across the fire, and she saw recognition there, an acknowledgement of shared understanding. In that moment, despite their different backgrounds, they were simply two people who had lost something precious to the same criminals. The night grew colder as the fire burned lower, and Sarah pulled her blanket closer around her shoulders. The stars above were brilliant in the clear mountain air, more numerous and bright than they ever appeared from her cabin. The vast sky made her feel both small and connected to something larger than her immediate troubles. Joseph banked the fire carefully, leaving enough coals to rekindle it easily in the morning. He spread his bedroll on the far side of the clearing, respecting the proprieties even in their unusual circumstances. Sarah appreciated his consideration, though she suspected that propriety was the least of her worries in their current situation. Sleep did not come easily on the hard ground, despite her exhaustion. Every sound in the darkness seemed magnified, from the distant call of an owl to the rustle of wind through the pines. But gradually, the peaceful sounds of the wilderness began to soothe her urban-trained nerves, and she drifted into fitful slumber. She woke before dawn to find Joseph already stirring the fire back to life, moving silently in the gray pre-dawn light. The air was sharp with cold, and frost covered their blankets like scattered diamonds. He had coffee brewing by the time she fully awakened, the familiar aroma a comforting bridge between the wilderness and civilization. "The trail is clearer ahead," he said as they shared a simple breakfast of bread and dried meat. "The ground is softer in the canyon bottoms, and the cattle left deep prints. We should catch up to them today." Sarah felt her pulse quicken with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. The theoretical pursuit was about to become concrete confrontation, with all the dangers that implied. She checked her rifle again, making sure it was loaded and ready, trying to project a confidence she did not entirely feel. They broke camp efficiently and resumed their tracking as the sun climbed above the eastern peaks. The trail led deeper into the canyon country, following watercourses that carved increasingly dramatic landscapes from the red sandstone. The beauty of the place was breathtaking, but Sarah found it hard to appreciate scenery when her attention was focused on the growing freshness of the tracks they followed. By midday, Joseph estimated they were no more than a few hours behind their quarry. He became increasingly cautious, checking frequently for signs of the thieves' presence and choosing their route to minimize exposure on open ground. The tension was contagious, and Sarah found herself constantly scanning the landscape ahead for any sign of movement. They were following a narrow canyon when Joseph suddenly raised his hand for silence, then quickly dismounted and motioned for her to do the same. He listened intently for several seconds, then pointed toward a bend in the canyon ahead. She could hear it now, the sound of cattle moving and men's voices echoing off the stone walls. Joseph led their horses back around the previous bend, where they could not be seen from ahead, and tied them securely. He checked his rifle and cartridge belt with practiced efficiency, then turned to Sarah with an expression of serious concern. "There are at least 4 men with the cattle, just as we expected," he said quietly. "They have stopped to rest the animals and are preparing to camp for the night. This is our best chance to recover the stolen livestock, but it will be dangerous." Sarah's mouth felt dry, but her resolve remained firm. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. Joseph outlined his plan with military precision. They would wait until the thieves settled into their evening routine, then approach from 2 directions to surround the camp. Sarah would position herself to cut off escape routes while Joseph confronted the men directly. If shooting started, she was to fire over their heads to create confusion and discourage resistance. The plan sounded reasonable in theory, but Sarah knew that reality would likely prove more chaotic. Still, the alternative was to abandon her cattle and return home empty-handed, which would solve nothing. She nodded her agreement and checked her ammunition one final time. They spent the remaining daylight hours moving carefully into position, using the broken terrain to conceal their approach. Joseph's knowledge of tactics and fieldcraft impressed Sarah repeatedly as he found covered routes she would never have considered. By sunset, they were positioned to observe the thieves' camp from concealment. The stolen cattle were held in a natural corral formed by canyon walls and a makeshift fence of brush and rope. Sarah could identify several of her animals among the herd, their familiar markings visible even in the fading light. The sight of them stirred a fierce protective anger that surprised her with its intensity. The four thieves were exactly as Joseph had described them, organized and professional in their approach to criminal enterprise. They had established a well-defended camp with clear sight lines and prepared escape routes. These were not desperate amateurs, but experienced outlaws who had chosen their profession deliberately. As darkness fell, the thieves settled into their evening routine with the casual confidence of men who believed themselves safe from pursuit. They built a large fire and cooked a substantial meal, talking and laughing with the easy camaraderie of long partnership. Their relaxed behavior suggested they had no idea they were being watched. Joseph waited until the thieves had finished eating and begun to prepare for sleep before giving Sarah the signal to move. She crept carefully to her assigned position, using skills she had never known she possessed to avoid detection. The rocks and shadows that had seemed threatening during their approach now felt like allies, concealing her movements from the men below. When Joseph stepped into the firelight with his rifle trained on the thieves, his voice carried the authority of absolute determination. "You are under arrest for cattle theft," he announced calmly. "Raise your hands and step away from your weapons." The thieves' reaction was immediate and violent. Two of them dove for their rifles while the others scattered toward their horses, turning the peaceful camp into chaos in seconds. Sarah heard gunshots and saw muzzle flashes in the darkness, the sound echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. Following Joseph's instructions, she fired her rifle into the air, the unfamiliar recoil jarring her shoulders painfully. The shot had the desired effect of creating confusion, causing one of the fleeing thieves to stumble and fall in his haste to escape. But the situation remained dangerous, with bullets flying in multiple directions. Joseph's training and experience showed as he moved through the firefight with calculated precision, using cover effectively while maintaining pressure on the thieves. Two of the criminals were quickly pinned down behind their supply packs, unable to reach their horses or escape routes. The other two had managed to reach their mounts but found themselves caught between Joseph's position and Sarah's rifle. The battle was brief but intense, ending when the thieves realized they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered despite having superior numbers. The combination of surprise, superior positioning, and Joseph's tactical expertise had given them the advantage they needed to overcome the criminals' desperation. When the shooting stopped, 3 of the thieves were captured and bound, while the 4th had escaped into the darkness on horseback. Joseph was grimly satisfied with the outcome, having recovered the stolen cattle and eliminated most of the gang in a single operation. Sarah found herself shaking with reaction as the adrenaline began to fade, amazed that she had actually participated in a gunfight and survived. The experience had changed something fundamental in her understanding of her own capabilities. She was not the helpless widow her neighbors believed her to be. The captured thieves were surly but defeated, recognizing that their profitable enterprise had come to an end. Joseph questioned them efficiently, learning the locations of buyers and other details that would help territorial authorities prosecute the remaining members of their organization. As dawn broke over the canyon, Sarah helped Joseph organize the recovered cattle for the journey home. She counted 17 animals that belonged to various ranchers in her area, including 5 of her own. The sight of her familiar livestock filled her with profound relief and satisfaction. The return journey took 2 days, slowed by the need to manage the cattle and transport the prisoners. Joseph handled both tasks with his usual competence, but Sarah found herself contributing more than she had expected. The experience of the past few days had awakened skills and confidence she had not known she possessed. When they reached the valley where her homestead lay, word of their success had preceded them. Neighbors who had shunned her for months now gathered to reclaim their stolen animals and hear the story of the capture. Their attitudes toward both Sarah and Joseph had shifted dramatically, from disapproval to grudging respect. The territorial marshal arrived to take custody of the prisoners and record official statements about their crimes. He was impressed by Joseph's work and surprised by Sarah's participation, commenting that few women would have shown such courage in similar circumstances. More importantly for Sarah's immediate situation, the recovered cattle included breeding stock that significantly increased the value of her herd. Combined with the reward money offered for the capture of the thieves, she would have enough funds to satisfy her creditors and save her homestead. But the financial salvation, significant as it was, seemed less important than the transformation she had undergone during the pursuit. She had discovered reserves of strength and capability that extended far beyond managing a household and tending chickens. The woman who returned from the canyon country was fundamentally different from the one who had received the foreclosure notice. Joseph remained in the area for several days, completing his official reports and ensuring that all the recovered livestock reached their proper owners. He visited Sarah's homestead to check on her welfare and was pleased to see that she had used her new confidence to make improvements that had been beyond her courage before their expedition. Their relationship had evolved during their shared adventure from wary cooperation to mutual respect, and finally, to something deeper and more personal. The cultural barriers that had seemed so significant initially had dissolved under the pressure of shared danger and common purpose. When Joseph finally prepared to leave, Sarah found herself reluctant to return to her previous isolation. The partnership they had formed felt natural and valuable, something worth preserving beyond the immediate crisis that had created it. Joseph seemed to share her feelings, lingering at her gate longer than necessary and finding excuses to extend their conversation. Finally, he spoke the words that had been growing between them during their time together. "I have been thinking," he said carefully, "that your land could benefit from some of the farming techniques my people have developed for this climate. And you have shown that you understand the value of cooperation between different communities." Sarah understood the deeper meaning behind his practical words. He was offering not just agricultural advice, but partnership in building something new and valuable from the foundation of their shared experience. The scandal of such an arrangement would be significant, she knew. Her neighbor's newfound respect was fragile and could easily turn back to disapproval if she violated their expectations too dramatically. But she had learned that survival sometimes required choices that conventional wisdom would condemn. "I would be interested in learning new farming techniques," she replied, matching his careful tone while her eyes communicated her deeper acceptance of his proposal. Joseph's smile transformed his serious features, revealing the warmth and humor that lay beneath his professional competence. "I will return in the spring, when the ground is ready for planting," he said. "There is much we could accomplish together." As he rode away toward the reservation, Sarah stood in her doorway and contemplated the future that was taking shape before her. The foreclosure notice lay forgotten on her kitchen table, replaced by plans and possibilities she could never have imagined when she first read its harsh ultimatum. The winter that followed was the happiest she had known since Thomas's death. Her improved financial situation allowed her to make needed repairs to her buildings and purchase supplies for the coming growing season. More importantly, she had gained the respect of her community and the confidence that came from proven capability. When Joseph returned in the spring, he came not as a stranger offering assistance, but as a partner bringing knowledge and skills that complemented her own. Together, they implemented farming techniques that increased her land's productivity while maintaining its long-term health. Their marriage, when it came, surprised no one who had witnessed their partnership during the cattle recovery. The community that had once whispered about the impropriety of a widow living alone now celebrated the union of two people who had proven their worth through courage and competence. Sarah Mitchell Silverwind looked back on her desperate morning with the foreclosure notice as the beginning of her real life rather than a crisis that had nearly destroyed her. Sometimes, she reflected, the greatest gifts came disguised as the greatest challenges, and the courage to accept help from unexpected sources could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. The land that had nearly been lost to creditors now flourished under the combined knowledge of two traditions, producing crops that fed both settler and Navajo families. And the woman who had once been dismissed as a fool for trying to farm alone had become a bridge between worlds, proving that cooperation could create abundance where isolation had produced only struggle. Take a moment to reflect on Sarah and Joseph's story of courage, cooperation, and the bridges we can build when we look beyond our differences to find common ground.